I still hear it sometimes. The sound of my own laughter. Not the kind that fills a room with warmth, but the kind that cuts. Cold. Dismissive. The kind of laugh that doesn't know what it's destroying while it's doing it. I laughed at a girl who gave me something no one else had ever offered me in my entire privileged, guarded, deeply lonely life. I laughed at her love. And then I spent the next 2 years of my life crawling across 3 continents trying to find her again. She told me she loved me on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the light was coming through the tall windows of my estate in golden strips across the marble floor, and she was standing right in the middle of it, holding a small clay pot she'd painted herself, trembling just slightly at the shoulders, her dark eyes serious in a way that didn't match her worn cotton dress. Her name was Priya. She'd come to the village on the edge of my family's old property 3 months before that day. A girl from the hills, hired temporarily by my household manager to help in the garden because the regular groundskeeper had broken his wrist. She wasn't supposed to matter. That was the rule. People who worked in my world didn't matter to me personally. They came, they were paid, they left. That was how it had always been. But she kept appearing. Not in an aggressive way. Not in the way women usually did around me, calculating and perfumed and carrying a script. She appeared because the roses near my study window needed daily attention, and she gave them that attention like it was the most important job in the world. I'd catch her talking to the flowers sometimes, quiet, half-whispered words I couldn't make out, and something about that used to stop me mid-step. Something about a woman who was genuinely, privately tender with a living thing when no one was watching. I told myself it was nothing. I was curious, that was all. The way you're curious about a bird that keeps landing on your windowsill. She stood there that afternoon with that small painted clay pot, and she said the words plainly, without decoration. She said, "I think I love you. I know I'm not supposed to. I know who you are and who I am. But I thought you deserved to hear something true from someone, at least once." She wasn't asking me for anything. She wasn't making demands or presenting herself as an option. She was just offering truth the way she offered everything, quietly, with both hands open. I laughed. I didn't mean to. Or maybe I did. I'm not sure which version of that moment is worse for me now. I said something like, "Is that what you think this is?" And I gestured between us, between my tailored jacket and her clay-stained fingers, and I laughed again, and I said, "Go back to your flowers, Priya." One of my assistants was standing nearby. I saw him look away. Even he knew what I had just done. She didn't cry. That was the part that should have stopped me. Any other person, in any reasonable version of that scene, would have cried or run or fallen apart. She didn't. She set the clay pot down on the edge of the step very carefully, like it still mattered even now, looked at me for one long still second, and then turned and walked away across the lawn without looking back. She was gone from the property by that evening. No note. No complaint filed. No dramatic departure. She simply wasn't there anymore, and the roses near my study window started dying 3 weeks later because no one else talked to them right. I told myself it was fine. I had meetings. I had a portfolio worth more than most small countries. I had women who wanted to be photographed standing next to me, and invitations to things that most people dreamed about, and a life so full of motion and noise that there was no logical reason a village girl in a cotton dress should occupy a single corner of my mind. But she did. Not loudly. Not like an obsession right away. More like a splinter you don't notice for weeks, and then one morning you press your palm flat against a surface and feel exactly where it's been sitting all along. The unraveling started about 4 months later when my household manager, Margaret, handed in her resignation. She'd been with my family for 11 years. When I asked her why, she hesitated, and then she said something she'd clearly been deciding whether to say for a long time. She said Priya had come to her once, about 6 weeks before that afternoon on the steps. She'd come to tell Margaret something she'd overheard. A conversation between my company's regional director and an outside investor who was quietly positioning to push a fraudulent land claim against the old estate property, the one my grandfather had left to a local farming community under a trust agreement. The kind of slow legal dismantling that takes months to build and that people like me often don't notice until it's too late. Priya had written down what she'd heard, dates and names, in a small careful notebook, and she'd handed it to Margaret because she didn't know who else to trust, and she'd asked Margaret to make sure I knew. Margaret had passed the information to my legal team. The legal team had quietly killed the claim before it became a crisis. I had never been told where the information came from. And I had laughed at the woman who gave it to me 2 months later as if she were a child playing pretend. I sat with that for a long time after Margaret walked out of my office. I sat with the image of Priya, alone in the garden at night with a small notebook, writing down what she'd heard so carefully, not for any reward, not for any recognition, not even knowing if I would ever find out, just because she thought it was right. Just because she believed the farming families deserved to keep what they'd been given. And I had stood on my front steps and laughed at her like she was something small. I started looking for her the following week. Quietly at first. I sent a man I trusted to the village where she'd originally come from. He came back and told me she'd left the region. Someone said she had an aunt in another city. Someone else said she'd taken work at a textile cooperative in the north. The trail was loose and scattered, the kind of trail left by someone who isn't hiding but also isn't asking to be found. I flew to the north. The cooperative manager remembered her. Said she'd worked there 3 months, then left. He showed me a small painted sketch she'd left pinned to the break room wall, a rose in full bloom, 3 brushstrokes, the kind of thing a person leaves behind when they're still trying to make whatever room they're passing through a little more beautiful. I took a photograph of it and stood there in that break room for too long. From there the trail went cold, and then slowly warm again. A teacher in a mountain village said a young woman matching her description had spent a month there helping set up a small school library. Someone in that village gave me the name of a women's skills center in the western countryside where they thought she'd gone next. I flew there. Drove 3 hours through rain on a road that had no business existing. Found the skills center. Found a woman who knew Priya, who looked at me across a wooden table with quiet suspicion and said, "Why does a man like you need to find a girl like her?" And I didn't have an answer that felt like enough. I said, "Because I owe her something." The woman shook her head slowly and said, "She's not a debt, sir. She's a person." I left that room knowing she was right and feeling smaller than I had felt in years. The months stacked up. I told people I was traveling for business, and sometimes I was. But every city I landed in, I was also looking. Checking names. Following small pieces of information. A name on a community volunteer list. A mention in a local newspaper about a garden project in a poor district. A photograph posted by a charity organization that I almost scrolled past, and then didn't, because something in the edge of the frame. The posture, the way a woman was standing slightly turned with one hand resting on a flower bed, made my heart slam against my ribs before my brain could catch up. It was her. In a community garden project in a small town in the far south, 500 miles from where she'd started. She was photographed in profile, not looking at the camera, talking to an elderly man beside a row of sunflowers. She looked good. Steady. Like a person who has found the shape of her own life and settled into it without apology. I drove to that town. I didn't call ahead. I didn't send anyone. I went alone, which was something I almost never did anywhere, and I found the garden on a Wednesday morning, and she was there, kneeling in the dirt near the far end of the plot, doing exactly what she had always been doing, tending something living with quiet, complete attention. I stood at the entrance for a full minute before she looked up. When she did, she went very still. Not frightened. Not warm either. Just still, the way a person goes still when they are deciding something. I walked toward her. I stopped a few feet away. I had rehearsed things to say across 3 countries and 13 cities, and I had forgotten all of it the moment she looked at me with those same serious dark eyes and said, simply, "You came a long way." I said, "I know what you did. The notebook. The land claim. The farming families." She looked at the dirt for a moment, then back at me. She said, "That wasn't for you. That was because it was right." I said, "I know." I said, "I also know you stood on my steps and handed me something no one had ever handed me, and I treated it like a joke." My voice didn't hold as well as I needed it to. I said, "I have been trying to find you for a year and a half, Priya. Not to pay a debt. Not because I feel guilty, although I do. Because I have not been able to forget you for a single week since you walked away, and because every room I've been in since then has been missing the only person in it who was ever honest with me." She was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that asks you to earn it. Then she said, "You laughed at me." I said, "Yes." She said, "In front of someone?" I said, "Yes. And I've been carrying that every day since." She looked at the sunflowers for a moment, and I saw her working through something, weighing something, and I waited, because I had no right to rush her, and because waiting was the first honest thing I could offer. She said, "I didn't leave because you didn't love me back. I already knew you didn't. I left because you made me feel like my love was embarrassing. Like the most real thing I had ever felt was something to be laughed at." She paused. That took me a long time to put back together. I said, "I know. And I'm sorry. I'm not here to ask you to forget it. I'm here because I want to spend as long as it takes earning the right to stand somewhere near you again. Not because you owe me anything. Because you are the most genuine person I have ever known in my entire life, and I was too stupid and too proud to recognize it until you were gone." The sunlight was doing what it always seemed to do around her. Settling warm and specific, the way light does when it's not showing off. She looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and then something shifted in her face. Not a surrender. Not forgiveness given cheaply. Something more like a decision made by someone who had thought it through very carefully and was choosing to be brave one more time. She said, "You'd better not laugh this time." I didn't. I knelt down beside her in the dirt, right there in that little community garden at the edge of a town I'd never heard of before she led me to it, and I held her hand, and for the first time in longer than I could name, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not in a boardroom. Not in a plane. Not chasing something just past the horizon. Right there. With the woman who had once stood in a strip of golden light and offered me truth with both hands open, and who had turned out to be the one thing in my life I couldn't buy, couldn't replace, and couldn't survive losing twice. Sometimes the most expensive thing a man can do is laugh at something real. I know that now. I learned it the hard way, across every mile I walked trying to find my way back to it. If you were in her place that day, would you have forgiven him? Or would those miles have come too late? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. If emotional stories about hidden worth, class difference, and love that survives pride speak to you, share this with someone who needs to hear that real love doesn't give up, even when it should. And if you stayed until the end, the next story is already waiting for you, and it starts with a secret that 2 families buried for 20 years. 3/3